When two mighty rivers stop meeting, it is never the water that is to blame. It is the banks that forgot how to embrace. The India-US breakup is not just politics. It is a story of pride, power, and purpose colliding like thunderstorms over the same mountain. When two nations stand in the brilliance of each other's gaze, there is often a temptation to see not the truth of the other, but the dream we have stitched for them in our own imagination. The beginning of any great relationship is filled with a glow that blurs the edges of reality, allowing hope to paint over the flaws. It is a sweet and dangerous magic, the kind that convinces you that the sun will always rise in the same way, that tides will always come in gentle. But time is a patient sculptor. It strips away the marble of illusion, revealing the raw stone beneath. The India-US partnership was once hailed as a union of vision, values, and shared destinies. Leaders spoke in grand halls about mutual respect, economic growth, and the joining of strengths. But beneath those promises lay the quiet question: do we see each other as we truly are, or as we wish each other to be? When reality finally began to whisper, it came not as a shout, but as a series of small truths neither side wanted to confront. The first truth was that priorities were not aligned as neatly as they appeared in speeches. One nation sought rapid ascension without losing its voice. The other sought continued dominance while asking for compliance. Like two actors in the same play but with different scripts, their scenes no longer matched. The applause from the audience could not hide the fact that the dialogue was starting to falter. The expectations were painted in gold, but the foundation was made of clay, and under pressure, clay will always reveal its crack. Trust is not simply built on what is said. It is fortified by what is understood without speaking. Yet understanding faltered when assumptions took its place. India saw in the US a powerful ally who would value its independence and growing influence. The US saw in India a reliable partner who would support its strategic aims without hesitation. But when the moments came that tested those assumptions, neither found what they had expected. Agreements were signed in the glow of possibility, but the ink could not hold together visions that were pulling in different directions. It is here, in the quiet gap between expectation and reality, that responsibility begins to grow. Responsibility for not asking deeper questions. Responsibility for not listening when the answers were unpolished and inconvenient. To see someone clearly requires more than looking at their victories and strengths. It means acknowledging their fears, their stubbornness, their unyielding principles. And in diplomacy, as in life, it is easier to embrace a reflection than the full, unvarnished truth. The India-US story carried the fragrance of partnership, that in its roots was a mismatch of pace, ambition, and control. One side believed it could shape the other side believed it could remain untouched. When these beliefs collided, the glow of illusion dimmed, and the two were left staring at each other across a table where the warmth had drained away. This is why the mirror of self-reflection becomes the first step in understanding responsibility. Not to point fingers across oceans, but to ask whether the vision we held was ever real, or merely a reflection we adored because it looked like our own ideal. The tragedy and the lesson is that seeing someone clearly from the start might have avoided the slow erosion that followed. But illusions are seductive. They make the first days easier, the speeches grander, and the future brighter, until the day comes when the truth stands up and demands to be seen. Promises have a way of carrying more weight than the words that form them. They are not just agreements scratched onto paper or announced in the glare of cameras. They are quiet commitments that live in the hearts of those who hear them. In the story of India and the United States, many such promises were made, each one wrapped in the language of cooperation, friendship, and shared destiny. Leaders spoke of alliances that would endure storms, of markets that would open to each other's goods, of technology that would be shared to uplift both sides. These words floated high above the crowd, catching the light, inspiring hope. Yet the true measure of a promise is not in the applause it earns, but in the faith it sustains when the moment for delivery arrives. The India-US relationship was built on more than economic contracts. It was built on trust, that fragile, invisible thread that can bind even the most powerful nations. When trust is honored, it grows stronger with each kept word. But when a promise is made and left to wither, the thread begins to fray. For years, both sides made commitments in the glow of opportunity. Trade deals were signed, strategic partnerships announced, and joint initiatives proclaimed. Yet slowly the reality emerged that some promises were easier to declare than to fulfill. Sometimes the failure came from shifting priorities. A promise made in one political season could be quietly abandoned in the next, replaced by the needs of domestic agendas or the pull of other alliances. At other times, the promises fell victim to the unpredictable tides of global politics, disputes with other nations, economic downturns, or sudden security concerns. But regardless of the reason, each unkept promise left a mark. Each delay, each broken commitment became another stone in the wall growing silently between the two countries. The disappointment that follows is never just about the agreement itself. It is about the erosion of faith. Nations, like people, remember how they were made to feel. India remembered the pledges of fair trade that seemed to tilt toward one side. The U.S. remembered the assurances of alignment that turned into resistance at crucial moments. Neither side could forget the times when cooperation was replaced by hesitation, when support was replaced by condition. It is here that the responsibility becomes clear, not in the fact that challenges arose, but in the unwillingness to nurture the trust that was the foundation of the relationship. Promises are like lanterns lit in the darkness. They are not meant to be admired once and forgotten. They must be tended, their flames kept alive against the winds of change. In the case of India and the United States, too many lanterns were left untended. The glow faded, and with it the sense of certainty that once defined the partnership. When a promise is not kept, it does not simply vanish. It lingers in the memory as a reminder of what could have been. In the end, responsibility lies not only with the one who failed to deliver, but with both who allowed those failures to accumulate without honest reckoning. It lies in the choice to let small disappointments slide until they became large enough to reshape the relationship entirely. The India-US breakup was not born of one broken word, but of many promises left standing in the cold, their light dimmed, their meaning lost in the shadows. Partnership, whether between individuals or nations, is a delicate rhythm, a dance that requires both sides to move with awareness, respect, and balance. In the early days of the India-US relationship, the music was fresh and exciting, the steps confident. There was laughter in the rhythm, optimism in the movement. Each side believed it understood the other's style, and for a while the dance felt effortless. But over time, subtle shifts began to disturb the harmony. One partner began to move faster, pushing for a tempo that the other was not ready to match. The other resisted, slowing the pace, insisting on its own way. And when neither was willing to adjust, the rhythm began to break. Ego is the silent drummer in such moments, dictating the beat without asking if both can follow. For the United States, long accustomed to leading on the global stage, it was natural to expect its steps to set the pace. For India, newly confident in its rising influence, it was equally natural to insist on autonomy, refusing to be guided in directions that did not align with its own vision. Neither ego was inherently wrong. Pride in one's power is often earned through struggle, but together they created a tension that made each turn in the dance a test of will. The expectations woven into the partnership added another layer of strain. Each side imagined a version of cooperation that favored its own priorities. The U.S. expected unwavering alignment on strategic matters, economic openness on terms it preferred, and diplomatic support in arenas where it needed a strong partner. India expected recognition of its sovereignty, freedom to make decisions without external pressure, and genuine respect for its regional leadership. When these expectations collided, it was as if both dancers were pulling in opposite directions while still holding hands. The connection strained under the force. Missteps became more frequent. A trade negotiation would falter because one side refused to yield on tariffs. A defense agreement would stall over questions of trust and control. A diplomatic effort would sour because neither could agree on the language that defined their roles. Each of these moments was like stepping on the other's foot, not catastrophic on its own, but painful enough to make the next step more cautious, more guarded. In public, the dance continued. Speeches were made about friendship and shared values. Photographs captured smiles and handshakes, and declarations of unity were issued after each meeting. But behind the scenes, the rhythm had changed. The music no longer flowed freely. It was forced, adjusted, slowed and sped up in ways that felt unnatural. The joy of the dance had been replaced by the mechanics of keeping up appearances. When a partnership becomes more about winning the lead than enjoying the movement, the beauty of the dance is lost. The India-US relationship found itself in this space, where each step became a calculation, each gesture a negotiation. The ego of one clashed with the self-assurance of the other, until the floor between them seemed wider than it had ever been. The tragedy was not that either side lacked skill or desire to dance. It was that both forgot the music was never meant to be owned. It was meant to be shared so that the steps, though different, could still move toward the same horizon. Freedom is the kind of treasure that cannot be bought, sold, or borrowed. It is earned, protected, and guarded with a devotion that defies compromise. For India, freedom was not an abstract ideal but a lived history paid for with decades of struggle, sacrifice, and unshakable will. Every decision on the world stage carried the memory of that hard-won sovereignty, and every alliance was weighed against the question, will this strengthen our independence or weaken it? The partnership with the United States was no exception. While it brought opportunities for growth, trade, and strategic advantage, it also brought moments where choices had to be made between compliance and self-respect. There is a quiet but profound truth in diplomacy. True friendship does not demand the surrender of autonomy. Yet the nature of global politics often tests this truth. In its dealings with the United States, India was asked, subtly and sometimes openly, to align itself with policies and actions that did not always serve its own vision or its people's interests. These were not always unreasonable requests, but they came wrapped in the unspoken assumption that partnership meant agreement. For a nation that had fought to make its own decisions, the price of such agreement could be too high. The United States, accustomed to relationships where its influence carried the final word, sometimes viewed India's independence as resistance. In reality, it was not rebellion but the exercise of sovereign choice, a reminder that partnership cannot be measured only by how closely one follows the other's lead. This difference in perspective created tension, not because either side lacked respect for the other's capabilities, but because they defined loyalty in different ways. For the US, loyalty often meant alignment. For India, it meant respect for the freedom to choose. Over time, the moments of divergence began to accumulate. India refused to take sides in conflicts it viewed as outside its own interests. It pursued trade agreements with nations the US saw as rivals. It made decisions on energy policy, defense purchases, and regional diplomacy based on its own calculations, not on alignment with Washington's priorities. Each of these decisions reinforced India's image as an independent power, but also deepened the cracks in the partnership. The responsibility for the strain does not rest solely on the side that guarded its independence. It also lies with the side that could not fully embrace the idea that a strong partner might not always follow. True alliances demand a generosity of spirit, an understanding that differences in decision-making do not necessarily weaken the bond, but can, if respected, make it stronger. The challenge is that such generosity requires a humility rare in the realm of global dominance. India's insistence on autonomy was not an act of defiance, it was a declaration of identity. The United States, in its own way, was also defending what it believed was necessary to maintain its leadership in the world. Both acted in accordance with their values, and both paid the price in the form of distance. The breakup, when it came, was not the result of a single disagreement, but the cumulative effect of many moments where independence and influence collided. And in that collision, the partnership lost the easy trust it once carried. Sometimes the most telling part of a conversation is not what is said but what is left unsaid. Words can fill a room with the illusion of understanding, but silence, that heavy, unbroken space between exchanges, often tells a deeper story. In the case of India and the United States, long before the breakup became official, there were silences that hinted at a growing distance. They were not born out of politeness or thoughtfulness. They were the kind of pauses that come when neither side wishes to confront what it already knows. In the early days of their partnership, conversations were frequent and animated. Leaders exchanged ideas, crafted plans, and spoke with an openness that made the relationship feel alive. Over time, however, those dialogues became more guarded. Meetings were still held, statements still issued, but the ease of expression was fading. The pauses between discussions grew longer, and when they came together, the tone was measured, calculated. What had once been a natural flow of words became a careful weighing of them. Part of this change was rooted in growing differences over priorities. When one side wanted to move forward on strategic defense initiatives, the other hesitated, citing sovereignty and cost. When one pressed for economic concessions, the other countered with demands for fair treatment and recognition. These disagreements were often papered over with polite diplomatic language, but the silence after each meeting carried the weight of unresolved tension. Neither side wanted to be the first to bend, so both waited, and in that waiting, the space between them widened. Trust, once broken or even strained, often struggles to find its way back. Both nations had moments where they felt the other had not been fully transparent. For the US, it might have been India's refusal to take a firm stand on certain international issues. For India, it was the perception that the US was pushing its own agenda without fully considering India's perspective. These feelings were rarely voiced openly, but they lived in the quiet moments, in the hesitations before answering, in the decisions to delay or avoid certain conversations altogether. Diplomacy thrives on dialogue, but when silence becomes the dominant language, it signals a turning point. Every time a tough conversation was postponed, every time a sensitive topic was brushed aside, the partnership lost a little more of its vitality. The silence was not a peaceful one. It was a silence of avoidance, a shield against conflict that ultimately allowed misunderstandings to grow unchecked. Eventually, the unspoken became impossible to ignore. The absence of real conversation meant there was no shared space to address grievances or realign expectations. Decisions were made independently, sometimes in direct contradiction to the other's interests, and the lack of prior discussion made each action feel like a betrayal. The silence had shifted from being a symptom of tension to being the architect of it. The breakup between India and the US was in many ways a product of these unspoken truths. The pauses were not empty, they were filled with doubts, with unasked questions, with frustrations neither side was willing to risk putting into words. And when silence takes the place of dialogue, it does not preserve the peace, it slowly erases the connection, until what remains is only the echo of what once was.